Okay, so now I want to show you again how to add materials to your objects. The way that we do that, let me turn off symmetry here. Remember, there's always multiple ways you can access the same kind of tools. So there's some of the tools that are in the tool setting here are also here in your modeling toolkit window. So if I want to add a material to this object, there's two ways that I can do it. There's many ways, but two that I'll show you. If I go to my attribute editor here, remember this does have the default material Lambert 1 attached to it. So the two ways I can do it is by right-clicking on my object and then assigning a new material down here, or I can go to my rendering tab in my shelf and I can select one of the shaders that are here. So the shaders that we have available to us that I would recommend using are this first one's a blend, and remember down in there's this little help bar here, so you can hover over any button. In this case, it will tell you what that tool does. This will add a blend material. This is a Lambert. This is a Phong. This is Phong E. It's just different. It's just a different set of code in order to interpret things like reflections, the way that light bounces off of the object. Is it matte? Is it shiny? So you can kind of play with any of these materials. These are all of our Maya materials. If I go here, we have, actually it's going to be under the Arnold shader. There's another type of material. That's an Arnold shader if you're going to render in Arnold, but if you're going to render in Maya, use one of these shaders. So I'm going to maybe add this Phong to my cube here, and now I can rename it if I'd like. I'll say red cube, and then I'll change the color. I press 6 on my keyboard so that I can see it. Remember, 1 on your keyboard shows you the shape of the object. 2 interprets smoothed with a wireframe of the original object. 3 is just a preview of what your object would look like smooth. So always be working in 1. Make sure that if you see something that looks like this, where it looks like it's not, where your faces look more rounded or curved, make sure that you hit 1 on your keyboard so you can actually see the object that you're making. 4 is wireframe mode. 5, I'm just hitting these numbers. These are just hotkeys on my keyboard. 5 is shaded. 6 is shaded with textures. That's how you can see your materials. And then 7 is what your lighting preview looks like. So I have no lights in the scene, so it's all black. It's dark. So I'm going to go with 6 for now so I can see my material. I have all of these different properties that I can change. I can change the transparency of something. I can change the color of it. And then I can also add files here. And these files will allow me to I can add a texture file to any of these channels within my material. So something I can do here under transparency, for example, is add a ramp. These are some textures that I might work with here. I might think about ramps. I might think about noise. I would maybe stay away from things like ocean and water unless you want to Google what to do with those, because they may or may not render correctly. They're kind of depreciated textures, I believe. So. And then there's some other textures here. If you want to add a texture file, you can add the file here. Okay, and I don't want to do that quite yet. These are how I get back. I can go up or down my node chain, right? Because these, you can think about it as a kind of tree or a hierarchy as these different packets of digital information attach themselves to your virtual object here. So I'm going to go back up. If I don't want this texture file attached to this channel, I can right-click and say break connection. So instead I'm going to add a ramp. A ramp is a gradient. I'm adding it as a texture channel, and we can see how this gets applied here. And basically what it is, it's saying that black being no information, white being full information on the alpha channel, and this particular ramp, right, this gradient is now being applied as a 2D, as a flat 2D texture to my 3D object. So let me show you actually what so there's the way that textures wrap around your object are called UVs. They wrap based on UVs. So if I go to my UV editor here, I can see, excuse me, how this 3D model unwraps as a UV. And I can also, if I work in face mode here, I can select my faces and I can see where they are in my UV editor. Okay. So this is why these, let's see, right? We can see maybe how this texture, which goes from, that's applying a dark to light gradient, or let's say it's applying an opaque to transparent gradient, a ramp into my transparency channel, how that gets applied here. That's why these three surfaces are, for the most part, opaque along this bottom edge, because that's where the white is. And then as it wraps up, we have increasingly more transparent sides, right? And then this bottom surface is most transparent. So there's many different ways, and I would just start, if you want to work with textures, I think you need to do some research on your own, or we'll have to have a kind of video conference and I can show you a little bit more about UVs. But this is just so you have a better understanding of how something like a texture, which is a 2D image, it's a square image, it fits here within this UV texture editor, how it gets applied to a 3D object. I can change like the way the ramp applies here. I can say I want it to be radial, right? And that will change the way it's applied to my texture, I mean the way it's applied to my model here. Okay, so that's the way that we would add textures to different channels in our material node. Okay, and then I can jump up or down the channels here. So I can say, let me go back to my object. There it is. And here's my material that I've added. To add lights again, we are going to use these Maya lights. An ambient light is going to flood. It's not related. It looks like a sun maybe, but it's not related to any physical properties of the sun, which casts shadows, because the sun is a real object in space that does have direction to it. So this ambient light will flood in every direction all over a uniform light. So if you want to add an overall brightness to everything in your scene, you might play with this. But you're going to use a combination of a direction light, which is more like the sun, which means that your entire scene will be flooded with light from a single direction. A point light here, this allows, this is kind of like a bare light bulb in the room, and if I place it in my scene, it will, if I hit 7, I can see what it's looking like here. It will shine a light within a kind of radius around wherever this object is placed in space. So at a certain distance, it will no longer kind of influence the objects around it. Okay. And then a spotlight here kind of works like a flashlight. Okay. So these are your different lighting objects. And if I go to my render view now, I can preview what this looks like. So I'm going to click on my render view here. The two things to be aware of are your render settings and your render view. I would recommend for this project to render out in Maya software, because Arnold will take longer and there's just more to learn about how to use a more complicated renderer. So let me click on this clapboard here and we can preview what our scene looks like. And I'm rendering it in Maya software at a particular size. The frame number is here, how long it took to render, and then which camera I'm rendering from. So this is what my scene looks like so far. Okay, so again, like this shape, the shape of what my render is going to look like doesn't necessarily correlate to the kind of arbitrary scale that's my viewport. So I'll show you again how to turn on that resolution gate so that you're able to preview in your scene what your camera will render out. Another thing while we're working in this render view, that if you are testing out the way materials and lights interact with each other, you can create kind of temporary images here by clicking this button, because every time I render, it's just going to render over what I had previously. So if I want to say, oh, I'm not sure, I think that looks better than what it looked like when I had the light at intensity 2, but I'm not sure, and this is the way you can test it. So now I have a kind of queue that I have a queue of images that are just temporary renders, and I can kind of see this is a way that we would do test rendering. Okay, I can get to my render settings either here, this is the clapboard, or you can get it here with this little gear. If I click on my render settings, these are the render settings that I want to render out. I want to eventually be rendering as a JPEG, and I want to not render just a single frame. I want to render an image sequence, and this last one on the list, name underscore number dot extension, will give us a great image, will give us a list of image sequences. So I'm going to click that, and then I'm going to set the name of this. I'm going to set it to demo render, or however I want to, whatever I want to render it as. You could say scene 1, scene 2, scene 3 if you want to do some post editing, if you want to render out a bunch of things and then do some post editing. And then you can see up here where the path where these images are going to be saved. So if you set your project right and you populated it with all of your project windows, then it's going to be under my demo folder, which is my project folder, and then that'll be in my image folder. Underneath our file output, we have our frame range, and this is where I can set, I want 1 frame, and I want to start frame at a particular frame, and I want to end this render at a particular frame. So I can render out chunks of this at a time. So it doesn't matter. What I'm going to do is I'm going to animate my whole scene, and then I'm going to render out chunks of the animation here. Or I can render it all out if I have just one camera doing something that I want to render from. This is where I choose which camera is going to be rendering from. Right now I just have one camera, the perspective camera. We haven't gotten into cameras yet, so that's something I will talk about. And then the last thing on the list, which is important, which I specified in the assignment, is that we want to choose HD 720 as our preset. Okay, so this will render out an image sequence of JPEGs if you've set everything right here, and I can scroll back through it slowly. Here I have, I'm rendering out an image sequence, JPEGs, into my folder, and I'm setting them at 1280 by 720, HD 720. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and hit close. So my render settings are ready to go. All right, let me jump out of this.